Hello everybody, this is Professor Ramirez and I would like to talk to you about Agatha Christie's Crooked House, and the specific focus for today's lecture is metafiction. So what is metafiction? Metafiction is when an author, like Agatha Christie, composes a narrative so that the story reflects back on itself. A narrator or character expresses the author's awareness of the construction of fiction, of the creation of fiction. In this case, we see Josephine, Charles, and other characters reflect on the conventions or the expectations of being a detective, or they refer to the conceits, the elements of a detective story. So what I would like to do is to go through a few quotes that I've selected. These are what I consider very important quotes, and they constitute this phenomena of metafiction. So let's begin with the first one. I've always wanted to be a detective. I'm being one now. I'm collecting clues. This, of course, is 12-year-old Josephine, and we know that her character is a snoop, that she eavesdrops, that she reads things she shouldn't be reading, like letters, and she watches people. So what Agatha Christie is doing is she's setting up Josephine as this novice detective. At the same time, Agatha Christie is establishing Josephine as a novice detective. I think Christie is also referring to her own work as a detective fiction writer. And I say that based on this next quote. This is, again, Josephine talking. He says women can't ever be great detectives, but I say they can. I'm going to write everything down in a notebook, and then, when the police are completely baffled, I shall come forward and say, I can tell you who did it. And then Charles says, do you read a lot of detective stories, Josephine? Masses. So here Christie is, I think, referring to her own work, in which she has a number of stories in which we have female detectives. For example, the Miss Marple series. And so she's challenging this stereotype that women cannot be detectives. And of course, this is, by today, a somewhat unfamiliar stereotype, because we have plenty of series in which we have female detectives. But back in the 1940s, when Agatha Christie was writing this novel, there were really no models. And so in some ways, Josephine is, she's going against the grain, and she's challenging gender expectations. And this other line, do you read a lot of detective stories? Again, this is, I would say, a reference to the popularity of detective fiction. I think I've already mentioned, or you should already know, that Agatha Christie was an immensely successful detective fiction writer. She was a billionaire, and her work was, next to Shakespeare and the Bible, it was very, very popular and immensely successful, and read all over the world and in translation. So there's sort of this reference to the popularity of detective fiction, and especially with young audiences like Josephine. Okay, so the next quote involves Magda, who's Josephine's mother. We know that Magda is an actress and that she's always cultivating her next role. Do tell me, cried Magda, leaning forward. What is it like at Scotland Yard? One always wonders. A table? A desk? Chairs? What kind of curtains? No flowers, I suppose. A dictaphone? Put a sock in it, mother, said Sophia. And anyway, you told Vavasour Jones to cut that Scotland Yard scene. You said it was an anticlimax. It makes too like a detective play, said Magda. Edith Thompson is definitely a psychological drama or psychological thriller. Which do you think sounds best? So in this moment, again, Agatha Christie is reflecting on, through her characters, the conventions of writing either a psychological drama or a psychological thriller. which I think in some ways Crooked House is, as well as being a detective story. And then she also makes reference to one of the most important locations for a British detective story, which is Scotland Yard. Scotland Yard is where all the detective work takes place. And so Magda is, asking about Scotland Yard. At the same time, she's saying, it would be too conventional, too ordinary, too cliche. Let's go on to the next quote. I admit Josephine's got into rather difficult ways. She's got horrible habits of snooping, but I really think it's just because she's playing detectives. And so this is another fictional comment where characters are playing at being detectives. This is Agatha Christie's acknowledgement that she's the puppet master and she's orchestrating these characters, putting them into conflict with one another, creating suspense. And that is where Josephine's character comes up. She's putting herself in places where she shouldn't be. She's, as I mentioned before, she's eavesdropping. She's playing a detective. She's uncovering clues. The next quote, she's mad keen on this detecting stuff. Goes round poking her nose in everywhere and writing things down in a little black book and pretending she's finding out a lot. So this is one of the, again, the self-conscious moves by Agatha Christie, where one of her characters is writing down the clues. And anytime you have a reference to writing in a story, you should really attend to it because it's a signal. It says from the author, pay attention to this. So that little black book is going to be something that is hugely important in the text. The next quote is by Josephine. I should say it's about time for the next murder, wouldn't you? And Charles says, what do you mean, the next murder? Well, in books, there's always a second murderer about now. Someone who knows something is bumped off before they can tell what they know. You read too many detective stories, Josephine. Again, this is Charles talking. Real life isn't like that. And if anybody in this house knows something, the last thing they seem to want to do is to talk about it. So again, we've got this awareness of what are the conventions of a good detective story. And it's true that one murder seems to follow another in Agatha Christie stories. And remember, she wrote dozens and dozens of novels. She started her writing career in the 1920s and she passed away in the 1970s. So she had an extraordinary literary career. She knows what the conventions are of detective fiction, and she helped to reinforce many of those conventions as well. You've got home a bit late for the big event, I said, and this is Charles talking to Josephine. Chief Inspector Taverner has arrested Brenda and Lawrence. I expected that Josephine, in her character of young detective, would be thrilled by this information, but she merely repeated in her maddening bored fashion, yes, I know. You can't know. It's only just happened. The car passed us on the road, Inspector. The car passed us on the road. Inspector Taverner and the detective with the suede shoes were inside with Brenda and Lawrence. So of course I knew they must have been arrested. I hope he gave them the proper caution. You have to, you know. This is yet another moment where Agatha Christie refers to these elements that lend detective fiction a sense of verisimilitude, a sense of authenticity. And what we would call in our justice system, the caution, we'd call it the Miranda warning. And it's basically the idea that you don't incriminate yourself before you've been judged. You want to be very mindful of what you say because it can be used against you. And Josephine, because she's read so many detective stories, she knows what that warning is. And that's why she calls it the proper caution. Okay, another important quote. This is a warning from Charles to Josephine. He says, already you've had 2 very narrow escapes. One attempt nearly did for you. The other has cost somebody else their life. Don't you see, if you go on strutting about the house and proclaiming at the top of your voice you know who the killer is, there will be more attempts made, and that either you'll die or somebody else will? In some books, person after person is killed, Josephine informed me with gusto. You end by spotting the murderer because he or she is practically the only person left. Again, this self-consciousness. And Charles says, this isn't a detective story. This is Three Gables, Swinley Dean, and you're a silly little girl who's read more than is good for her. I'll make you tell me what you know if I have to shake you till your teeth rattle. I could always tell you something that wasn't true. You could, but you won't. What are you waiting for anyway? You don't understand, said Josephine. Perhaps I may never tell. You see, I might be fond of the person. She paused as though to let this sink in. And if I do tell, she went on, I shall do it properly. I shall have everybody sitting round, and then I'll go over it all, with the clues, and then I shall say, quite suddenly, and it was you. So here Agatha Christie is referring to a very common scene in her detective works, and it's that it's the revelation, it's the moment where everybody gathers and the clues are exposed and shared one by one, and the culprit is announced, the murderer is announced, and so. When she says you end by spotting the murderer because he or she is practically the only person left, I think of one of Agatha Christie's other very successful stories, And Then There Were None. It's also been made into an amazing film. Sure enough, we know who the murderer is because there are very few characters left. And then we have Charles's admonishing Josephine when he says, this isn't a detective story. But of course, Crooked House is a detective story. So this is Agatha Christie's playfulness. The last quote I want to talk about is when Charles says, Josephine, you told me you were almost sure who the murderer was. Well, who is it? She gave me a look of scorn. I see. Not to the last chapter, not even if I promise not to tell Inspector Taverner? I want just a few more clues, said Josephine. Anyway, she added, throwing the core of the apple into the goldfish pool, I wouldn't tell you. If you're anyone, you're Watson. I stomached this insult. Okay, I said, I'm Watson, but even Watson was given the data. The what? The facts. And then he made the wrong deductions from that. Wouldn't it be a lot of fun for you to see me making the wrong deductions? For a moment Josephine was tempted, and then she shook her head. No, she said, and added, anyway, I'm not very keen on Sherlock Holmes. It's awfully old-fashioned. They drive about in dog carts. I love this line. Here's Agatha Christie not only reflecting again on who the murderer might be from Josephine's perspective, but also making reference to Conan Doyle's immensely successful Sherlock Holmes series, and Josephine's slight, her insult, saying that Charles is Watson, and of course that positions her as Sherlock Holmes. And yet we're reflecting back on the idea that Josephine aspires to be a modern detective, and she says, I'm not keen on Sherlock Holmes. It's awfully old-fashioned because it's taking place in the Victorian period in the late 1800s. They drive about in dog carts, and of course Crooked House, they've got cars. This is the 1940s. They're sophisticated, they're cosmopolitan, and we know it's Josephine's aspiration eventually to live in London. That concludes a selection of quotes that express Agatha Christie's metafictional craft in Crooked House.